Welcome, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going back in time, exploring a really fascinating and honestly pretty unsettling part of Italian history. We're looking at the Ospedale Psiquiatrico Giudiziario, also known as OPGs.
Ah, the OPGs.
Yeah, so for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you tell us a little about what these places were?
They were, well, you could call them judicial psychiatric hospitals.
Yeah.
Basically, a mix between a hospital and a prison, specifically for people considered both mentally ill and dangerous.
A dangerous combination, I imagine.
It was a system that sparked a lot of debate, I can tell you that.
Unsurprising, really. I mean, the idea of confining people indefinitely based on those criteria raises all sorts of ethical questions.
Exactly. And the whole concept of the foldere, which basically means the criminally insane, was a huge point of contention in Italy going all the way back to the 19th century.
So the OPGs didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were rooted in this long-standing debate.
Absolutely. You had, on the one hand, the classical school of penology, which focused on punishment for crimes. The idea that people choose to commit crimes and should be punished accordingly.
Makes sense. Kind of an eye for an eye approach.
Right. But then you have the positivist school, which started gaining traction around the late 19th century. They saw criminal behavior as more the result of things like biology and social factors, things outside of a person's direct control.
Interesting. So less about free will and more about, determinism?
Yeah, to a degree. And this clash between these two schools of thought, that's really where the whole idea of the OPGs comes from.
And figures like Cesare Lombroso, he was a big proponent of that positivist view, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Lombroso, he's the guy who believed that you could actually identify criminals based on their physical features.
Wait, seriously? Like, you could just tell if someone was going to be a criminal based on how they looked?
That was his theory. Of course, it's highly controversial today. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? But his ideas had a huge impact back then. And the whole concept of the born criminal, the idea that some people are just predisposed to criminality, that fed directly into the thinking behind the OPGs.
So if you believed in this idea of the born criminal, then what? You'd think that locking them up forever was the only solution.
Pretty much. The thinking was that these mad criminals, as they were called, were a danger to society and needed to be locked away, possibly with some attempt at treatment, but the emphasis was definitely on containment.
And so that's how the first OPGs came about.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. The 1889 Zanardelli Code, it didn't fully embrace the positivist view, but it did create a legal framework for indefinite confinement of people acquitted by reason of insanity, especially if they were deemed dangerous.
So that's how it started.
Right. It was kind of this in-between solution, not fully positivist, but definitely moving away from the purely punishment-focused classical approach. And that paved the way for the first OPGs. They were like this hybrid of an asylum and a prison, which, is a pretty disturbing concept when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have this Zanardelli Code setting the stage. What happened next? I mean, how did these OPGs become a more formalized part of the Italian penal system?
Well, in 1904, there was a new law that institutionalized forced confinement in asylums, but it was the 1930 Rocco Code that really solidified the role of OPGs.
The Rocco Code. Tell me more about that.
Well, this code basically made OPGs a standard security measure for people acquitted due to mental illness. So if you were found not guilty by reason of insanity, you could end up in an OPG indefinitely.
Definitely. So, there was no set time limit, no chance of release.
Not necessarily. It was all very subjective and depended heavily on how dangerous the person was game to be, and also, frankly, on the resources available and the attitudes towards mental illness at the time, which, as you can imagine, weren't always the most enlightened.
Right. So essentially, this Rocco Code was like a compromise between the two schools of thought, the classical and the positivist.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It recognized the need for both punishment and security measures, but the security aspect, that's where the OPGs came in. They were seen as a way to protect society from these individuals who were, in the eyes of the law, both mentally ill and potentially dangerous.
And this system, this dual system of punishment and security that essentially stayed in place for decades.
It did up until relatively recently. But as you might imagine, the OPGs, they were always surrounded by controversy.
I can only imagine. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, let's delve into that controversy, the eventual closure of the OPGs, and what rose in their place.
Sounds good. I'm ready when you are. So the OPGs were shrouded in controversy for much of their existence.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it before the break, but confining people indefinitely, potentially in really bad conditions, It's hard to imagine that not causing a huge uproar.
Right, and it did eventually. But before we get to that, it's important to understand the legal framework that allowed these places to exist in the first place. The OPGs, they operated under Article 222 of the Italian Penal Code.
And this article basically what gave the legal justification for locking people up indefinitely in these places?
Essentially, yeah. It allowed for the internment of people considered dangerous because of mental illness, and it didn't really set any clear limits on how long that internment could last.
Okay, so someone was deemed both mentally ill and dangerous. They could be sent to an OPG, potentially for life.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And this, as you can imagine, raised a lot of concerns about human rights and due process. I mean, imagine being locked up indefinitely, not knowing if or when you'd ever be released.
That's a terrifying thought. So there was no legal recourse, no way to challenge that confinement.
Well, there were attempts, and eventually the Italian Constitutional Court stepped in.
Ah, so there was pushback, legal pushback against this article.
Absolutely. There were a number of landmark rulings that challenged the indefinite nature of confinement in OPGs. One of the most important was a ruling in 2003, sentence number 253.
And what did that ruling say?
It basically declared that part of Article 222 unconstitutional, specifically the part that prevented judges from considering alternative measures to internment in an OPG.
Okay, so this ruling was saying that judges should have more options, that they shouldn't just automatically send people to an OPG.
Right. It was a huge step forward for the rights of people with mental illness in Italy. It recognized that indefinite confinement without proper treatment was a violation of fundamental human rights, and it forced the Italian legal system to start thinking about alternatives.
So this was a turning point.
Definitely. It really shifted the legal landscape. The court emphasized that any security measures had to be proportional to the actual risk posed by the individual, and crucially, that proper treatment for their mental illness had to be provided.
That makes sense. It's not just about locking people up and forgetting about them. It's about addressing their needs, their mental health needs.
Exactly. And this idea of proportionality, that was a key takeaway from these constitutional court rulings. It's not about punishing people for being mentally ill. It's about finding solutions that balance the need for public safety with the rights and well-being of the individual.
So was this the beginning of the end for the OPGs?
It was a major step in that direction, but the process of actually shutting them down, that took a while.
So the OPGs didn't just disappear overnight after this ruling.
No, it was a long and complicated process. There was a parliamentary inquiry in 2011 that really exposed the awful conditions in many of these places. Overcrowding, inadequate care, human rights violations. It was a big scandal.
And that, I'm guessing, really put pressure on the government to finally close the OPGs.
Exactly. They issued a decree to shut them down with an initial deadline set for 2013. But in reality, it took until 2015 to completely close all the OPGs.
Wow, so even with all the legal challenges and public outcry, it still took years to finally get rid of them.
It's a testament to how entrenched these institutions were, how deeply ingrained this idea of locking away the criminally insane was in the Italian legal and social fabric.
So what happened after the OPGs closed? Did they just release everyone?
Not exactly. They were replaced by a new system, Residenze per esecuzione delle misure di sicurezza, or REMS for short.
REMS. And these were intended to be an improvement over the OPGs.
That was the idea. They were supposed to be more therapeutic, focused on providing care and rehabilitation rather than just confinement. But, any new system has its challenges.
So what were some of the problems with the REMS?
Well, the biggest one was probably a lack of resources. There weren't enough REMS facilities to accommodate everyone who needed them, and there were also concerns about staffing shortages and a lack of properly trained personnel.
So even though the intention was good, the execution maybe wasn't quite there yet.
Yeah, you could say that. There was a lot of criticism that in some cases the REMS weren't really providing the level of care and treatment that people needed.
It sounds like a really complex issue with no easy solutions.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you balance the need to protect society with the rights of people with mental illness?
It's a tough question, and one that societies all over the world are grappling with. But I think the story of the OPGs in Italy, it offers a really important cautionary tale. It shows us what can happen when we prioritize confinement over care, when we fail to see people with mental illness as individuals deserving of dignity and respect.
Absolutely. So we talked about the legal framework, the closure of the OPGs, and the challenges of the new REM system. But I think what's missing from this conversation is the human element. What was life actually like inside these OPGs?
That's a really important question, and I think to answer it, we need to look at some specific examples. At the time of their closure, there were six main OPGs operating in Italy, housing over 1,500 people.
Over 1,500 people. That's a lot of individual stories, a lot of lives impacted by this system. So let's talk about some of those stories. Where do we begin? So last time, we were talking about these two different schools of thought on crime and punishment, the classical and the positivist. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all. Can we break those down a little further?
Sure, it's definitely complex stuff. So, with the classical school, it all started back in the 18th century. They were all about free will, the idea that people make conscious choices, and if they choose to commit a crime, they should be held responsible.
Okay, so it's all about personal responsibility and punishment fitting the crime.
Exactly. They wanted a justice system that was fair and equal for everyone, with clear laws and punishments that fit the crime. No special treatment, no excuses.
Makes sense, in a way. But then along comes the positivist school, and they have a totally different take on things, right?
Yeah. Positivists, they came later, influenced by science and things like biology and sociology. They were more interested in what causes crime. They believed it wasn't just about free will, but also factors like a person's biology, psychology, and social environment.
So instead of just focusing on the crime itself, the positivists were looking at the bigger picture, trying to figure out why someone might commit a crime.
Right. They thought that if we understand the root causes of crime, then we can actually do something to prevent it. And they were big on rehabilitation, trying to help criminals address the underlying issues that led them to commit crimes in the first place.
But that definitely sounds more humane than just locking everyone up and throwing away the key.
Oh.
But I can see how those two approaches would clash.
Oh, yeah, they definitely did. Positivists thought punishment alone wasn't enough. They wanted a more scientific approach to understanding and dealing with crime.
So where do the OPGs fit into all of this?
Well, the creation of the OPGs was partly a result of the positivist influence. They wanted a place where mad criminals could be treated and hopefully rehabilitated, not just punished.
So they were trying to apply that positivist thinking, looking at mental illness as a factor in criminal behavior.
Right. The idea was that people in OPGs needed a different approach than regular criminals. They needed treatment for their mental illness with the hope that eventually they could reintegrate into society.
Sounds good in theory, but we know from what we've discussed already that the reality of the OPGs was pretty grim.
Yeah, unfortunately, the ideal and the reality were very different. OPGs often became more about confinement than care. Resources were limited, treatment was often inadequate, and in many cases, the conditions were just awful.
A far cry from that vision of rehabilitation and reintegration.
Definitely. And I think it goes back to that societal fear of the criminally insane, the idea that these individuals are too dangerous to be treated, that they need to be locked away for everyone's safety.
Right. And that fear can lead to a lot of inhumane practices. It's a reminder that we need to be careful about how we approach mental illness, especially in the context of criminal justice.
Absolutely. We need to remember that people with mental illness are individuals deserving of compassion and care, not just fear and punishment.
Well said. I think this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into a dark chapter of Italian history. We've learned about the complex legal framework, the horrific conditions in the OPGs, and the